Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings, a listening library for critical conversation, reflection, and collective knowing across the global south. In this episode, I am in conversation with curator and artist Nimah Muwakil-Zakuri. Together, we move through memory, art, community, and the question of what it means to hold stories with care. We begin with imagination, with the insistence that art does more than describe the world as it is. It opens space for what might yet be possible. Nimah takes us back to a childhood shaped by resourcefulness and vision. She reflects on parents who chose another way of living, who built a home by the river with their own hands, and in doing so, taught her that creativity is a way of making life. As the conversation unfolds, we move through Cuba, curation, women's artistic labor, museums, public memory, and the fragile architecture through which a nation decides what matters and who is remembered. Nimah speaks with honesty and precision about the politics of cultural institutions, the exclusions that shape national collections, and the urgency of building archives that document communities from the inside. This reasoning asks what it means to create with care, to treat memory as living, to see community itself as archive, to understand that what we preserve is never neutral and that what we fail to hold may disappear. I want to start by grounding us in a quote from Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks writes that the function of art is to do more than tell it as it is. It is to imagine what is possible. And I wanted to start with an invitation to ask you to share a story or memory that captures how you understand the relationship between art, imagination, and healing.
It's interesting that you quoted bell hooks and that particular quote about imagining possibilities. I grew up in the 1980s with parents who reimagined every aspect of their lives, and they really pushed all the boundaries that they could. My mother grew up Catholic, and from a very young age she pushed back against all of that. And my father as well, he grew up Anglican, and he always talked to me about his search for something deeper. He always felt that there was always something else that was calling him. They built a life together just based on imagining a different future, something that was totally out of the trajectory that anybody could have imagined for them. Of course, they made mistakes, and that's the kind of environment that I grew up in, to always question things, push boundaries, and imagine things that you may not even think could be a possibility for your life. And I think that is definitely something that defines the way I look at art, the way I look at life, the way I look at relationships as well.
What is the earliest memory you have of, feeling called to art as an avenue to express, to explore possibility?
Yeah. So one of my earliest memories um, is me living in a house by the river. So that's why I call myself Art by the River on Instagram. So it's a whole story, it's a whole world
Yeah.
that kind of inspires everything that I do. So again, coming back to my parents, so my dad was 26 at the time, my mom was 24, and he decided that he did not want to rent. He had a job, but he didn't want to rent a traditional house. He wanted to build something with his hands by a river where he could raise his kids,
Yeah.
and his mom lived on School Street in Carenage. And just further up from School Street, the land was completely undeveloped, and there was rivers and there was a forest. And he just decided that he just wanted to build a wooden structure there, and that's where he was going to live with his family. And obviously, I would not have thought of those things. I was 3, 4, 5. I think we lived there for about 3 to 4 years. But looking back now, I realized how that shaped my entire life. And Even talking to my younger brother and sister, he remembers a bit. My youngest sister doesn't remember as much, but he remembers a lot, and we talk about it a lot and how that experience really shaped who we are today. Because firstly, my dad, with the help of his brother, built an entire house for his family with his own hands, out
Yeah.
of wood. And for me, that was something, so creative and imaginative that you could just see a piece of land with trees and dirt and, just forest, and imagine something there that you could build and raise your family. And so that experience, coupled just the simplicity with which my parents approached life and approached the way they did everything, really had a deep, deep impact on me.
I'm having all sorts of thoughts as you were reflecting. My father has 13 siblings and they all build and my cousins as well. I haven't thought about this before you said it. There's a way in which, like, I grew up seeing them building houses, and I just made the connection between that and the way in which, like, when I want to do something, I do it. There's a, it's almost as though I felt like I grew up seeing people who thought about something and then just executed it. And I hadn't thought about the early memories of seeing that,
Yeah. Yeah.
how
As
that
I said,
probably influenced me. Yeah.
yeah, in the moment as a child, you don't think about it. But then as you go on in life and you start to develop your own personality, looking back, I realized, what you're saying is so true. Like to see somebody like your father, or even my mom, she was very creative, just create something out of nothing, and almost not just nothing, it's almost like an impossibility. Like he just out of his own creativity and resourcefulness,
Yeah.
he was able to build and care for his family and be happy. I clearly remembered there was a hammock and probably two Morris chairs in the living room. So most of the time we sat on mats on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, was a kerosene stove, kerosene light in the night. It's just really, really simple. And my mom did not come from that. My father did not come from that either. He had electricity in his house. My mom grew up in Belmont. She had electricity, but they just decided to go on this completely different path. And I don't think they even understood what they were doing in terms of the impression that that would have had on us. To be able to see into impossibilities and into nothingness and actually see something that most people don't see.
You then grew up to be a curator and an artist. When did you begin to see curation as a professional practice? Um, and because I've seen your work too, as a form of storytelling and healing, when was that connection made for you?
Okay, so I did not have any aspirations to be a curator at all.
Okay.
At all. So my entire life, growing up, I was like, I want to be an artist. I want to open my own art gallery, and be a gallerist and artist, whatever. My dad always encouraged me. He's like, "That's what you want, go for it." Even my grandparents buy art supplies all the time, and I was just and you hear other people saying, "Oh, my mom doesn't want me to do art," or they think it's a hobby or whatever, and I never had that. They always encouraged me. So when it was time to go to university, I remember in the art room, they had all these magazines from all these great art schools around the world, but my parents couldn't afford it. So my dream was to go to Savannah College of Art and Design.
Yeah.
Obviously, I didn't get to go, but a friend of mine told me that I should check around to like embassies because they give scholarships. So I went to all different kinds of embassies. Ended up at the Cuban embassy, and it's like, yeah, we have scholarships, Cuba CARICOM scholarship. So I applied and I got in. But I don't know if they didn't translate the documents properly. I thought I was applying for a visual arts degree. It ended up being an art history degree.
Wow.
And I didn't even know that art history was a thing you could study. I didn't know that. I mean, we learn a bit of art history, but I didn't know you could actually get a degree in this thing. So when my father realized that it was, because this is after I've been accepted to go to Cuba. This is in
Okay.
2001. And it turns out to be art history instead of art. I was devastated. But I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna go anyway. I'll take my art supplies and I'll paint and I'll try to get a transfer because there's a great art school in Havana as well. When I got there, I realized how complex it was to be able to get a transfer, and I just said, you know what? I kept painting and I immersed myself into this art history world, which I ended up loving. I was like, wow, because I love history as well. And then the way they teach it in Cuba is you don't get a heavy amount of like Western art history and European art history. They touch on it, but they go really deep into Caribbean art history, Caribbean film, history of photography in the region, history of cinema. And so when you leave there, you're highly prepared as a Caribbean professional. And not only the English speaking Caribbean, of course, the whole of Latin America. And in the program, we were afforded the opportunity in the last 2 years to actually work in museums and art galleries and to have a couple group projects where we curate shows. And I just fell in love with it. And I realized that it was God's plan
Yeah.
for me to do that. I didn't get to study art formally, but I still had the passion for it. I still painted and did that, but I also had this whole other world that opened up to me. Um, and in a way, I realized that, like, all through my teenage years, I was curating, but I didn't know. So if you like ask my siblings, I always had collections of things. And I always say, I remember, like, long ago, they'd have a lot of trends and toys that would come out and different, like, gadgets and things like that. And I always remember saying, I'm going to save this so my grandkids could see it. And I have, like, collections of all kind of knickknacks. So we moved so much that a lot of my stuff got lost.
Yeah.
But looking back now, I realized that I was kind of curating in a way my life,
Yeah.
just without understanding what curating was. That's the history of how I ended up where I am now. So after when I came back to Trinidad, obviously I went straight to the National Museum as a OJT, and from there I was able to advance my career as a curator, but while still painting and exploring my own artistic practice. Can't say that there was a particular moment in my life that things just happened, almost just life just one stage of life just flowed into the next until until I am where I am today.
I want to ask you to speak a little bit about Cuba. Cuba is such a special place in the Caribbean
Yeah.
because of the history. It's a place marked by rebellion, taking a stand, and there's an energy. What was it like spending 6 years in Cuba? What comes to the surface for you when you think about that time? And you think about it in terms of who you are, your identity as okay, somebody from Trinidad and Tobago, race, ethnicity, religion, like what comes to mind when you think about who you are and how you experienced and moved through Cuba.
Yeah. So Cuba was not easy.
Yeah,
Cuba was not easy on many levels, but I think what prepared me for it was going back to that simple way that my parents brought us up, just not being extravagant, just understanding that, resources are limited, but that you're not gonna die. You
yeah,
could survive, if you're frugal and if you just, be imaginative with what you have. So we went across there. We spent a year kind of just being oriented in terms of the language and the culture and things like that. So that first year was quite easy because they were holding our hands and we were in a university where there were a lot of other foreigners kind of going through the same orientation process. We didn't have to speak much Spanish because in the dorm, my entire room was like Trinidad and Jamaican girls. So it's English we speaking all day unless we go to class.
yeah.
But after that first year now, we were thrown into our degrees and we were scattered all across the island. I remember like my first day in class, I was the only foreigner in the class. And when I went to Cuba, I felt like I was standing out a lot wearing my hijab like this. So I started to wrap my hair up. But what happened is I just ended up blending in and looking like a Cuban, especially because they sent me to Santiago. So they would assume that I was Cuban. So when
Yes.
my first day, I remember my first day in class, some of the teachers knew that I was a foreigner, but there was a particular teacher who didn't know. And she was actually teaching, there's this compulsory course that you have to do on the history of the revolution. And so she was teaching about that whole history and she was just like rambling on. And I remember after the class, everybody left and I stayed in class and I was crying because I did not understand anything. And after that, it didn't take long though, like something clicks in your head with the language. So after about 3 months, I was taking notes and just, being normal about everything. But it's something that could have broken somebody, being on your own. It was the first time I was away from my family for such an extended period of time. It forces you to just to pull all of the strength, whatever strength you had in you.
Yeah.
It was a place you had to bring it together now to fight and to be able to survive this thing. There's some people didn't make it. Some people had to go home. So it wasn't easy. But I think once I got the hang of it, I realized how privileged I was. Some people may not want to use that word, but I see it as that to be able to have my formal education in a society that was able to stand their ground, overcome so much that, they're almost like one of the beacons of the Caribbean in terms of sovereignty and being able to understand that what you have is something that you're supposed to treasure. We think of um, Europe and America as reaching the pinnacle, and that's the pinnacle of civilization, and everything that they do, we must follow. And here we have Cuba saying, no, we don't want any part of you. We don't want to be your backyard and your playground anymore, even if it means that we're going to have to suffer. Obviously, it has been really hard for a lot of them. But I think my general feeling was that most of the people who I interact with would not have traded it for anything else. I remember one of my teachers, she supervised my final project. And one day I had to go over to her home and she was talking to me about the period after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, they were a big um, supporter of Cuba, obviously. They
Mhm.
got a lot of their resources and raw materials and food and everything. And there's this like urban legend that
Mhm.
during that period of that high economic period, boys used to play football in the street with eggs. That's how much they had.
Wow.
Maybe, it's just a saying, that's just to say how much they had back then. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, everything changed. And she talked about how they really had nothing and they just had to eat like rice and you know, find all kind of innovative ways to do things to be able to survive. I wasn't prepared for her to break down like that. But after that, at the end of it, she's saying that even after all of that, she's proud to be who she is. She's proud to be from Santiago. And she understands that the revolution saved them from something that could even be worse. And she
Mhm.
wouldn't change it. There are Cubans who want to leave and you know, they don't care about all of this. They just want to leave. But most of the people who I interacted with did not have that sentiment at all. I would not be the person who I am with if it wasn't for Cuba. But the way that I see the world so hinged on the experiences that I had.
I hear that it shaped how you tell stories, how you see the world, how you really inhabit yourself as a curator. So you get back home, and you start now to do this work. What does it mean to curate emotional memories? And do you think institutions can meaningfully hold feeling?
One of my first experiences when I came back to Trinidad working at the National Museum as a on-the-job trainee, I came in at a time when they were doing a project to digitize the national collection, which was amazing because I literally got to touch every single piece of art in that collection. If I had come like a few months later or a few months earlier, I would not have been involved in that project. And I would not have had the intricate knowledge that I have about our national art collection. So I was an OJT, moving paintings, helping the photographer, doing research, doing different things. But I was able to get a sense of the history of our arts in Trinidad and Tobago, what types of art the government felt they was significant enough to collect and what was not significant, what kind of budget was given to collect art and what was not given, so one of one of the things that stood out for me was that there were a high number of male artists in the collection. But I know that there are a lot of female artists painting. So, and that was one of the questions, why so many male artists? It's just a general trend globally. People have written about why women artists are left out of art history so much. One of the biggest exhibitions I curated at the museum was in celebration of Sybil Attuck's 100th birthday. I was in 2011. So she was born in 1911. Sybil Attuck was a pioneer of Trinidad and Tobago art. She was one of the founding members of the Trinidad Art Society in 1936. And she was really pivotal in bringing into the national purview. And I wanted to, highlight women artists in Trinidad and Tobago in a way that they hadn't been before, and also to recognize her and her contribution. So that was actually just 2 years before I left the museum. I think I would say that that's the biggest show that I've done to date because of the space at the central bank. The central bank space is smaller and there's a lot more limitations in terms of some of the things you could do, even though I've been pushing those boundaries. But at the National Museum, it's a huge space and I was able to showcase probably 40 or more women artists practicing. We didn't have a big budget for acquisitions. So that particular show, people were saying, oh, we didn't know there was so many women artists in Trinidad that you could do a whole show and have a whole book and look at all this history. And it's it was a great time for me to be able to have the opportunity to do something like that, like seeing something that was lacking in the space and being able to bring it forward.
I want to talk some more about women in art in Trinidad and Tobago, but I want to talk a little bit about women's stories and what are some of the tensions that arise when we think about curating um, women's art.
I understand some of the challenges because when I decided that I would stick with art history and not do my degree in art, I still painted and so in the background. But then when I came back home to work and I had that for the role and at the museum was highly administrative. There was a lot of, creativity with it, but it was highly administrative. Like, as a curator, you're supposed to be given the time and space to curate. But in my instance, I was doing everything. I didn't paint, I didn't do my practice for a long time. I would say about 10 years. It took me 10 years to pick up a brush. And I see that a lot with women, when they start having kids, get married, and life takes over. They push their art practice aside, not because they want to, but it feels like almost like it's impossible because you have all these other things, all these other demands.
I can't help but go back to the beginning of this conversation when you talked about your mother and how your mother created as well. And I guess I'm curious about women's creativity and how it shows up and how sometimes societal expectations, norms, values could get in the way of that. And how we get in the way of it as well. because we're also products of this space. And talking about some of the tensions and what it meant for you and how you didn't pick up a brush for 10 years. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like I find that hard to believe. That's like,
No,
what?
it's true. It's
Yeah,
true. It's true. What I did in that time, I wrote a lot.
yeah,
I wrote. I like to write poetry and just write. So I was
yeah,
writing, and in a way that was kind of preparing me to start back to paint. It's all art, you know, but the painting takes a different kind of energy, and that took me 10 years to get back to. And I
yeah,
feel like for women, it's something that happens. And because I think art generally still is, after all these years, seen as like a hobby, a thing that you really can't make a living out of. And if you have children, you need to have a serious job. And, you know, we live in a very conservative society. And, you know, Sybil Attack, I come back to her again, she really pushed the boundaries. You know, she did not have kids, and maybe that's something that worked in her favor. But I also think that she understood the moment that she was living in. She understood what um I guess her responsibility was as a creative and the things that she needed to do, and she just did it. So she was working as a teacher, as an art teacher at Providence, and the Hilton Hotel approached her to do a piece in their lobby, and she had to make a decision because this was a big deal. It was a lot of work, and she would not have
yeah.
been able to teach. And the decision that she made was to leave her teaching job and to go and do that. And that was a project, so that was going to end. And she obviously she didn't know what was going to happen after, but she chose art, you know. And so I always looked at her as a Trinidadian, somebody who was an artist and a creative. I always looked to her as to inspiration. I always talk to people about her.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe if more women, artists, more young women knew about her story and the things that she did and the things that she overcame, we might have seen, you know what, I'll choose art too, you know, despite everything, despite what everybody's telling me, I might choose art too. So I think that's one part, like one of my missions is to highlight stories like that within not only the artistic community, but I also do a lot of work with the Muslim community and, you know, highlighting women in our community who have kind of paved the way for others to come.
So you're turning 5 weeks off for me. I'm a Providence old girl. So I went to Providence.
Yeah. So you know of me? You know?
No Alpha, but I would have come in. Miss Judy D'Souza was actually running art when I was there. So I
Yeah.
know about the Providence Art Room. And we have a sculpture, the Inner Eye, that's right in the middle of the school. You can't miss it. I also did ceramics with Maria Nunes before she went into photography.
Yeah.
I did art for sexy. As a girl in a school, being surrounded by art made a mark on my life, but I didn't connect it to continuing into adulthood, right? So I did art for CXC and then I didn't paint or do anything with visual art for like 25 years. Like I almost forgot. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's almost like an afterthought. Oh yes, I did art, but growing up in that environment, and spending 5 years there, it was never thought about as a career, as something as a feasible thing to do. And I was around artists and appreciation of art. And I literally locked it away until um, many, many, many years later. So hearing you speak about that, the fact that it brought back those memories of growing up with art and music as a fundamental part of our experience was such a powerful, powerful thing to me. But there's not a lot that's known about her
No,
story.
it's not a general knowledge. Like if you're an artist, you might know, but even young artists, I find they don't know a lot about local artistry. They don't know Picasso and whoever, but just to call 5 artists from Trinidad.
And if they do, it might be the male artists that are more well known. So you're doing this work and you are presenting these women artists in a public space. Was there pushback to do that? Like what made you prioritize that as a project? And what kept you going?
Yeah, I don't want to come across as that I'm solely focused
Yeah,
on
yeah, yeah,
women artists, right?
yeah.
Because I understand the value of art across the board. But when you see something, things that you see that you can't unsee, and I couldn't unsee the fact that we did not have enough representation in the national. It's a national collection. It should have a representation. And so when I did my MPhil at UE, the focus, it was not on women artists, but the focus was on the representation of women in art. Because I kind of wanted to go further and see how male and female artists were representing women in art. My thesis started off with a story. So it's a story of it. I was not around when this happened. I was a child. But there's an artist called Irini Shaw. Um, I don't know if you know Christopher Cozy, that's his wife.
Yes, I
So
know.
right.
I know the
They were,
husband.
yeah. See? You see? And
Yep.
she's just as accomplished.
Wow.
So that's his wife, and they both studied formally and they came back to Trinidad. And her first solo exhibition, now she focuses a lot on human figure and, self-reflection. She does a lot of self-portraits, a lot of nude self-portraits as well. So she had her first exhibition and a solo show. And one of the pieces was a woman giving birth. So the viewer is seeing the woman's legs open and the baby and blood and the umbilical cord and all of that. And our teacher brought his students to the gallery. It was a boys' school. But I'm not sure how it happened. But basically that piece was taken off of the wall, and then the boys were allowed to see the show, because they didn't want the boys to see that piece of a woman giving birth. So I actually started off my thesis with that story of Irini and what she went through. She eventually ended up, running the Holy Name Art program. So she recently retired, and she continued painting over the years, but that particular story is one that, when I heard it, I realized that there's so many hurdles that women artists have to go through just to be understood and to be seen. I think she was paving the way for a lot of women artists to be able to explore themes like that. So why can't a boy or a man see a woman giving birth? This is something extremely natural. This is something that happens, and we trying to censor that. She went on to mentor and teach a lot of women artists in Trinidad and Tobago who've gone on to do great things. So she obviously had her impact, but I feel like that experience was really hurtful for her, because I'm not sure that she had another exhibition for a number of years after that. Maybe one day I'll sit down and talk to her, but I feel like she kind of drew back into herself and went into teaching and things like that. But it's really interesting.
That story is so powerful. There's so many places, so many things to unpack in it. Yeah.
Fast forward, because I think this was in 1988 or something like that. I feel like fast forward to now, something like that could happen still. I
Yeah.
feel like something like that could still happen.
And what does that say about us as a society? What does it say about our institutions? What does it say about power and policing art?
When I was at the National Museum, um, during that 5-year period, we probably changed. It was 2007 to 2013. We had 2 elections in that time, I believe. And so there was a lot of changes in terms of the ministry, the minister, the permanent secretaries, what they wanted to call the ministry. I don't know if you remember arts and multiculturalism. They did a whole they paid for people from all over the world to come down to talk to us about multiculturalism, very expensive thing at the Center of Excellence, and create this whole long policy about kind of telling us who we are and what we already know and what we already do. And it was a serious upheaval. And coming back to Cuba, they have had a Ministry of Culture since the start of the revolution, right? It's never changed. This is the Ministry of Culture. You could add things that you want culture to be inside of that, right? But this is the Ministry of Culture. And I think that kind of stability is what fosters development and growth in the sector. When you have people coming in every 4 years, sometimes less, because in the middle of an administration, they may decide, oh no, we want to change the name, or we want to put this department in tourism and put this with community development. People don't realize how upsetting that is for the people who work in the ministry, for the people who stand to benefit the stakeholders, because you're just tossing culture and art around like a ball, like you don't know what to do with it. There's no stability, and I think that is what has affected the development of our art institutions. Because there's no home. There's no home. Quite recently, it was arts. I can't remember what it was, but now it's community development and culture. So it was with tourism before, and now it's community development and culture. Just as an example of what's happening right now, I was on the board of the National Museum, and after the elections, we said, they have to change the board. Obviously, I understand that. And I don't have any expectations of being called back to serve again. It doesn't matter to me, but I want there to be a board. Now, all of the institutions underneath that ministry, they all have boards installed.
I was having a recent reasoning with Deborah McPhee, and she was talking about how gender, art, culture are things that just kind of rule around the government machinery. People don't really know what to do with it.
They don't.
So when you just brought up that thing about how many times have we had these name changes, and name changes happens across the government institutions, but there's something about gender, art, and culture. We don't know what to do with it. I don't know if it speaks to that lack of pride around what this is and what it represents and how it can be used. It definitely speaks to a fundamental problem that we've had across different governments. It's not linked to any
No, it's
particular
not.
government.
It's
Yeah. So I think it speaks to a broader issue that we have within our structures. When we think about museums and cultural projects, can we move towards transformation? And what would it take for those spaces to become spaces for recognition, but also spaces for initiating, triggering change and transformation? And do you think that those institutions, museums, have the teeth, have the power to really become spaces for transformation?
so in the museum world, we understand that museums have soft power. We don't have the teeth and the claws, but we do have soft power if we understand the kind of spaces that we are. We're supposed to be neutral spaces that encourage discourse and discussion on topics that are relevant to the society. And it's not that we're going to skew in any particular direction, but we create safe spaces so that these discussions could take root and happen, and then solutions can come out of that. And that's where the power of museum lies. So it's power, but it's soft power. And for me, over the last 5 years post-pandemic, this is what I've been trying to do at the Central Bank Museum. Obviously, I would have my personal views on, what's happening right now in the region, or, what, over the pandemic, what happened. But as a professional, I'm not going to get that into the space. What I need to do is make sure that people have a space to discuss it. And, when you look at online forums and these other social media platforms, things could get kind of sticky and scary, especially when you're not seeing the other person in front. It gets really toxic. And I think that is the role of a museum, to bring people together face to face to have these discussions. I missed community, even in my community, in terms of my religious community. I missed the days where we had more gatherings and we did things together. We but you have a WhatsApp group and we meeting online, and it's just a totally different feeling. And I sometimes feel, really sad that my children don't get to experience that I experienced, that face-to-face connection. I want to create spaces, within my power there in my little museum, for people
Yeah.
to come and be able to talk about things and to express things in a space that you're not going to be canceled and you're not going to be called names, and that that is that is the power of museums. That is where museums are gonna. And, we need to stay neutral. So as much as I would talk about politics and all of that and my frustrations, that will never get into to how I serve the public, no matter who walks in the door on a particular day. You know, they get to feel safe. They get to the same experience anybody who walks through the door. And one of the things that I'm also coming to realize is that we cannot continue depending on the government. And I'm part of a network of museums in Trinidad and Tobago. We actually just formalized ourselves this year, the Trinidad and Tobago Alliance of Museums. And most of the museums under the alliance are non-governmental museums. Most of the museums in Trinidad and Tobago is somebody in the garage or the living room been collecting things for decades and decided one day to open it up to the public, and operating on very little funds and donations and, entry fees from the public. So as much as I would complain that happened, but it doesn't mean that good is not happening as well. People around the country understand the power of museums and the power of teaching people about our history and our culture, and they are doing the work. So, for example, the Tamana Mountain Chocolate Museum, we have a few cocoa and chocolate museums, agriculture type based museums, even the Lopino area, they have their museum. But the Tamina, they're doing a really good job, because when you go there, they actually giving you, in a fun way, the whole history of cocoa in the country. And they're doing a lot of grafting and protecting seeds. And they're showing you, like, on their whole farm, they have so many different varieties of fruits and different plants that people used to use, but we don't use them anymore. And they're kind of dying in terms of our cultural memory. And they're working to preserve all of that. So people are doing the work.
Yep.
What I would love to see is the private sector kind of step in more to support these smaller museums across Trinidad and Tobago, because, and the whole idea of us forming this alliance is so that we can, as one body, reach out, not so it's not just one voice in the dark here and there, so that we could reach out as a, entity to try to get some help from the private sector. We will reach out to government too, but from what I've seen across the region, even in the US, the museum industry is, for the most part, out there propped up by the private sector and private donations and people, well wishers and things like that. And the government kind of, once they see things happening, they will step in and, give a grant here and a grant there. But generally, it's private sector. And that's what I'm trying to encourage the museums to do.
When you speak about museums, in a sense, it sounds so accessible. following that thread through this conversation about you collecting things as a girl. Um,
Yes.
it almost feels as though we can all have museums and we can all archive things. So, what kind of archives do you think we need to continue to build? And I guess I want to invite you to also speak about your work within the Sun Society as well. I've been
Mhm.
to, I think, two exhibitions. The involvement of youth in those exhibitions,
Mhm.
amazing. And just the ways that it invites people into lives and spaces and memories um, that are not theirs or that they may be looking at from the outside, very distant too. So, what kind of archives do you think that we need, that we still need to develop?
Well, for me, I think archiving, in the sense that we know it now, is very colonial. I I I understand why the colonial authorities needed to write every single thing, document everything, take samples of everything, because they didn't know here. This was something that they were conquering. This was something that they had to control, and the only way they knew how to control it was to document it and keep track of it. But that's not how we archived. Wherever we came from, or indigenous societies, that's not how we archive. We archive by going back to the same point I was making about spending time with each other and passing on that traditional knowledge. That's how we archive. Obviously, now in a society like ours that we're in this global climate, we need to archive in that way, and I totally understand. But we have to do it with a bit more intention and not just about documenting every single thing without any kind of context and without understanding the people who doing this thing. So
Well,
that's one part of it. If there's any archive that we need right now, it would look like a community archive. It would look like not just going into a community and documenting everything or looking at a particular manifestation of art or culture and just documenting it, but having intergenerational dialogues where a grandmother with a grandchild, like people bringing people together, creating spaces that people could be together. One of the
mhm,
things that I miss about Cuba is that in every town, in every little area, they have these parks, right? And on any given Saturday night, Sunday night, you would see entire families there, people selling ice cream, people having their little, they sell this little nuts, like just how we always sell nuts and popcorn, and people just there talking and interacting. And there was just a lot of, that kind of community happening. And when I look around, like if I have to take my kids somewhere, I have to spend money. You have
yeah.
to go, you're going to watch a movie, and what you're watching, some foreign movie.
Hmm.
Uh, you have these big arcade places with a whole set of noise.
Hmm.
Maybe the closest I'll get to that is going to the beach. But then when you go to the beach, you're watching, you're cautious of people, you don't know who coming to take your bag, you have to be careful, you just can't stick with your own family. And I think as time goes along and we continue like this, something is being lost, and it's not going to get any better if we continue like this. So for me, if there's any archive that we need right now is a community archive. And to create a community archive, you need to have spaces.
Hmm.
Right opposite me is a savanna, and it's hardly frequented. There is a huge community space because people are not feeling safe to be there. They don't go. And then there's no free spaces that you could go on a weekend with your family. And it cannot be the mall. Your grandmother might be living with you, you on your phone. You don't know what you're losing out by not. to her and then she's gone. You don't even know what you lost. That's what I feel. That is the archive that we're losing. And I don't know how. I don't know what the solution is. I have ideas, and museums can play a big role in that. And one of the questions, because I just came back from the Sao Paulo Biennial in Brazil last week, right? And one of the questions I have now to ask myself and to discuss with my staff is, in what ways is the central bank and this imposing structure a barrier for people to come into the museum, and how we could fix that? Because I see when I went to Brazil, this is huge imposing building, 3 humongous floors of art, but people were coming in, people felt comfortable to come in, families and things like that. But I still feel like here, nobody feels that they could walk into the central bank, even though, yeah, you have a museum, you can walk in at any time, it's free. But I still want to find out if there are barriers to that. So just to round off the point, community, community archives and museums and the role that they could play, even community museums, like other communities visiting neighboring communities, having discussions. That's what I would love to champion. That's what I think we need right now. That's what I think is missing in this society right now.
A
Yeah.
collective care.
Yes.
Very, very powerful to think about it that way.
Yeah.
And when I hear you speak, I'm hearing you say that we're not curating for our present self, but we're curating for our future selves. I think it's also powerful to think about the fact that the colonial lens needed to collect in a certain way, and
Yeah.
for us to question if that's the way that they need to collect. Is it of service? Is it contributing to care?
Yeah, there's obviously some merit to it. But if we look at our national archives right now, it's underfunded and they are not able to sustain that kind of collecting and archiving. So as you're saying, is it sustainable? Is it the right way to look at it? Can we do things differently? Yeah. Can we collect and save things with a little more intention? Are we even collecting the right things? Because they have a mandate to collect government papers. There's this retention period, and then the things would go to the archives. And then not everything, it's just specific things. But what about the other things? There are things that we losing, like on the ground in the communities, ways of doing things, ways of cooking, ways of taking care of babies, like all those things. And there are people doing the work, but there's no one place, there's no one center that you can say, okay, this is where I could go and record something, and it will be kept for people to learn about how my community did some. So there's a lot to think about.
I feel as though you just issued a call.
I feel
You felt like a very strong call for us to think about what are we collecting and how we attending to community, and
yeah.
how we attending to collecting our stories and its usefulness in the present, but also its usefulness for our future selves. So I guess I want to invite you to close with a reflection on what does it mean to curate with care, and to treat what what we curate as sacred rather than symbolic. What does that mean?
In my artistic practice, I say art is every day, meaning the way you speak to people, the way you greet people when you see them in the morning, the way you dress, types of things you decide to wear or eat or read or consume online. All of that is part of the art of your life. And I carry that with me every day. Your life is a piece of art that it carries into the future. we also curate our lives, like what you decide to hang on your wall. Okay, so like this painting I have in the back there, it's by a male painter, but I do most of the paintings in my personal collection are women. But this particular one kind of drew me. It's called Revolution. It's by Ralph Beanie. So his wife was a ceramicist and a sculptor. He was also a sculptor, but he painted. And this particular painting is called Revolution. And it's abstract, but you can see figures like there's a woman standing over a man who's either injured or bleeding or dying or something like that. And every time I look at this painting, I see something different. I've had it for over 10 years. I try not to hoard. I try. But there are things that are so, so special to me that bring back so many memories. And, the way that you keep your house, your surroundings, and look at you, look at your work, look at your books. This is how we curate our lives. And I think curating is allowing the things that we see in the world that affect us in a positive way to be able to reflect that in a way that others have a glimpse of. If I put that in the context of me curating a show in a museum, you're never neutral as a curator, never, because I am going to bring all of my experiences. So if I want to do a show on, for example, something I'm working on now, carnival and resistance, I'm going to look at resistance in the context of how I understand resistance. You are going to try to have a wide lens, but at the end of the day, you're a person and you're bringing to your research your biases. Another thing that's important to me post-pandemic is a lot of collaboration on that idea of community, because I don't have all the answers. So the idea is to understand Carnival, where it came from, understand resistance, and bring people, creators, thinkers, researchers together who could now create a base and a platform for us to be able to have discussions around these things, to develop new ideas, because we do have all the answers.
A lovely way to end. I am so grateful for this conversation. What lingers for me in this reasoning with Naima is her invitation to think of curation as something far deeper than arrangement or display. Curation becomes ethics. It becomes a practice of care, what must be brought back into view, and what future we are making through what we choose to hold close. Naima reminds us that archives are not only found in official buildings, catalogs, or state collections. They also live in kitchens, in family stories, in community spaces, in children listening to elders, in objects kept for years because they carry something we cannot name. She asks us to consider what happens when those spaces of transmission begin to disappear and what it might mean to rebuild them. This conversation is a reminder that art is not separate from life. It is how we make meaning, how we remember, how we gather, and how we leave something behind for others. I hope this episode stayed with you and perhaps calls you to think about the stories, objects, histories, and relationships you are carrying. To learn more about Naima's work and the artists who are mentioned in this episode, be sure to visit tracyrogers.com/saltwater reasonings. Until next time, take care.